So we are
It was
recording
in
now.
the
I
context
hope it works
just
well.
the travel's awful.
Yeah,
This is
How
the
is it good? How are you
of
getting on?
conference.
good. I'm just focusing on trying to
And
figure
in
some
my
stuff
defense,
out
I'll just
at the
explain
minute
why
because
I
no
used that
participants
letter.
around, so
Yeah, it's a
If
bit
you look
painless to
at the
I'm gonna have to
usage,
really try and get
it's
locked
always
in
been less
September.
frequent. So just a quick search on Google
Yeah.
Scholar
Once
and then a
students
quick
are
search
back,
on word usage from Google Ngram. You can see that
trying to write
etiology with the A
presentation
has always
for
been
Canada, which is next month. So
less frequent
Okay.
than any other one.
Oh,
So
that-
there is
yeah.
actually
That'd be-
absolutely no reason why I chose
Hopefully
that
your
spelling. I
flights
just
will be-
like it.
hopefully, I'm hoping.
Mind you can
Right.
get to flight. Are you going
Yeah,
by?
but
Are you going out
I
of
have
Dublin
to
or?
go to Germany now.
Oh, you're going to Germany.
Yeah.
Network
So
analysis and
Germany.
relational frame theory.
That's a-
Why
going
am I
long
bringing
way
these
for
two
quite
things
some
time.
together?
Yeah.
These two things that seem to have absolutely nothing in common. Well, actually, yeah, they create some graphs that kind of look like each other, but their meaning, the reason these connections really don't have anything to do with each other. They mean completely different things. So in our terms, if you think about it, anything can be related to anything, right? You can always find a relation and relate things. So how is a banana related to Venus? You can, they're made of matter or whatever, yeah, and they're different in all other possible aspects. But there's always some way to relate things, and I think the way to relate things when we are bringing together network analysis and RFT is because they are two different approaches of etiology. At least from my point of view, I think these two things can actually help us understand the causes of psychological suffering, and so that's how I see the relation between these two things. Now, we are going to have our first talk right now with Miguel, who is right next to me. So Miguel is an associate professor in the psychology department at the University of Jaén. He obtained his PhD from the University of Almería. He has done a lot of RFT-based analysis about fear conditioning and avoidance learning using psychophysiological measures and behavioral tasks, which is something very important for my current PhD, actually. He worked on experimental analogs of verbal processes involved in acceptance and commitment therapy, and he's interested in the experimental analysis of language and cognition from a functional contextual perspective and its implications for psychopathology. We are now receiving Owen, who is going to be the next speaker right now. So that's Owen. Owen's going to talk after Miguel. He's a lecturer here in the School of Psychology of Ulster University. He held postdoctoral positions in the University of Liverpool and University College London, and a lectureship in the University of Leicester. I hope I'm saying this right. I'm more concerned about saying Leicester than Jaén, but anyway, interested in the measurement of epidemiology of mental health problems in young people, worked on analysis of longitudinal cohort studies, and currently leading a project funded by the Wellcome Trust using artificial intelligence to help integrate mental health data from around the world. Then we're going to have a poster session, and Jordan's going to talk. He's going to be a last speaker. He's an associate professor at Missouri State University, PhD by Southern Illinois University 2018. So he's an early career researcher. Even though he's an early career researcher, he has managed to publish over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. I don't know how he managed to do that. Impressive indeed. Co-authored 2 books, Research Methods for Practicing Behavior Analysts and Acceptance Commitment Therapy for Behavior Analysts. He leads the Hub Research and Practice Lab, Humans Understand Behavior, and he and his lab developed relational density theory as an extension of relational frame theory using quantitative metaphors from physics to explain complex linguistic and cognitive behavior. Now, just a couple topics before we start. Please, everybody mute their microphones. We are recording this, so this room focuses on whoever is speaking. It's focusing on me now. It's going to focus on Miguel in a minute, and then it's just going to record sounds. But anyway, so everybody in the room who has a computer, please let the microphones off and sound off because the room is managing the audiovisual. Posters. So we are not going to do posters on display kind of thing at lunch break, just because all posters are online. We have one physical poster. That poster is going to be on display. So there we go. But so the posters are going to be from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. our time, British summer time. each speaker has about 5 minutes to speak, but you can use a little bit more because we have about 7 presentations. So we have enough time for an hour. Right, so let's get started with Miguel. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And now, hopefully, we are going to see Miguel's content. We could see it before. So do you know what I'll do? I'll just disconnect and connect again, maybe, your HDMI cable.
Here?
Yeah, let's see if that works, because it worked before.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. Okay. So, well, the first thing is thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. I feel really honored. It's great to be in Ireland, and it's really great to have the opportunity to speak about, to talk about RFT and psychopathology. I explicitly like to acknowledge my appreciation to the School of Psychology and to Dermot Barnes-Holmes and Rodrigo, who Diana de Almeida, okay, who organized this meeting.
Thank you for coming.
So I will be talking about relational frame theory and psychopathology. I hope I'll try to cover RFT from, let's say, its introductory aspects to a little more advanced topics, and I will try to link all of it to psychopathology. So first of all, what is RFT? RFT, relational frame theory, is a behavior analytic account of human language and cognition, and more broadly of complex human behavior. A core idea in RFT is that language, defined as derived relational responding, has endowed humans with a unique capacity for suffering. And it sounds very like a terrible idea or a terrible prospect, but just like language has endowed us with a capacity for problem solving beyond anything. I mean, humans are very good at problem solving all sorts of stuff, and that's why we have, let's say, conquered all sorts of ecological niches. We also have a very unique capacity for suffering, and this is an idea that is shared with acceptance and commitment therapy, which is historically, conceptually, and empirically linked to relational frame theory. So we could say that even when we have everything to be happy, it's likely that we will find reasons to feel miserable or feel unhappy, even when we acknowledge that those reasons are irrational. So the history behind RFT is long, and it includes many things, from, I would say, problems with Skinner's original approach to verbal behavior, the very concept of rule-governed behavior, and how human behavior seems to be controlled more by, or at least in some contexts, more by rules and instructions than shaped by direct contingencies. The fact that human operant behavior in certain intermittent reinforcement schedules seems not to be very sensitive to changes in contingencies, not like non-human behavior. But I think by far the most important milestone would be the discovery of stimulus equivalence by Murray Sidman, which I guess many of you are familiar with. He was working with an individual with a severe developmental delay in trying to teach the individual how to read. Basically, he was training relations, conditional discrimination. So in the presence of the spoken word dog, they were training the individual to select a picture that matched the spoken word, and also to select a written word that matched the spoken word. And after considerably long training in this kind of conditional discriminations, some relations emerged between printed words and pictures that were not explicitly trained. So basically, the individuals spontaneously started matching printed words with pictures, and this learning was emergent. It was not directly trained. No contingencies of reinforcement had been programmed for this emergent performance. The concept of stimulus equivalence kept refining over the years, and basically it was defined by a series of formal properties. When you train conditional discriminations, usually employing matching the sample procedures, the idea is that stimulus equivalence should fulfill these or have these properties. The first one is reflexivity. When you are presented with a stimulus, you should be able to select the same stimulus when it is used as a comparison. We also have symmetry. When you are training a conditional discrimination and you learn the discrimination in one direction in the presence of a written word, you are trained to select a specific picture. You should be able to just produce the reversible relation symmetry. When you are presented with a picture, you should be able to select the corresponding printed word, even though that selection was not explicitly reinforced. And then we have transitivity that involves at least two stimulus relations. For instance, here, if I a picture of a dog in the presence of the written word dog, and I also learned that how to select the Spanish word perro for in the presence of the written word dog. Then untrained relations between the picture and the other printed word, the Spanish word, will emerge. I will be able to learn, to select perro in the presence of the picture of a dog, and to select the picture of a dog when I am presented with the word perro. So basically, I'll be able to combine those relations. And as you will see, some of those relations are marked with a solid line. Those are relations that were directly trained. So contingencies of reinforcement were provided, programmed for them. The relations that are marked with a dashed line are untrained emergent relations. These properties and this kind of transitivity symmetry relations are very easily demonstrated with verbal humans. Okay, very easily demonstrated with verbally skilled humans, but not with pre-verbal infants, individuals with severe verbal deficits, or with non-humans. I mean, there's some controversy around that, but we don't have lots of evidence that non-humans are very good at, especially at getting symmetry in the lab, at reversing conditional discriminations. Sidman suggested, obviously, the fact that these performances are untrained or emergent made Sidman connect this with language and the whole idea that perhaps they were a good model of how of the symbolic properties of language, how words stand for the reference or the objects they are supposed to represent in the world. Sidman suggested that equivalence might be a basic stimulus function that is unique to humans and would explain the symbolic and referential nature of language. Some other theories, the naming theory by Horn and Lowe, suggests that it is language that is necessary for equivalence to occur. So you have to be able to name stimuli in an equivalence class for stimulus equivalence to emerge. And then as far as I know, in the mid-80s, Stephen Hayes came up with a different alternative, that the relating behavior observed in stimulus equivalence was indeed a class of generalized operant behavior. So it is operant behavior that is learned through early language acquisition, history of multiple exemplar training, and both stimulus equivalence and the symbolic properties of language were functionally the same. And that this was also an important thing, that this form of relational responding was not limited to equivalence relations, or what we have termed coordination in relational frame theory, but other forms of relating were also possible, like two stimuli can be different, or one of them can be more than the other, or they can be in opposition, etc. So this is relational frame theory explains relating, the behavior of relating stimuli, and basically the properties that relating behavior must have from the point of view of relational frame theory are, I would say, are a bit more generic than symmetry and transitivity. The first one would be mutual entailment. Mutual entailment basically is about the bidirectionality of stimulus relations. If you relate a stimulus to another, if you relate A to B, then B should be related to A in a specific way. In equivalence or coordination or sameness, this is very straightforward, just like in stimulus equivalence research. If A equals B, then B equals A. But you also can have relations of difference. If A is not the same as B, then B is not the same as A. Opposition, if A is opposite of B, then B is opposite of A. Comparison, and a multitude of potentially different patterns of relational responding. So if I learn that a video game system costs more than a book, which my 8-year-old is learning these days, she will very easily derive that a book costs less than a video game system, even though I don't have to explicitly train her with that relation. Combinatorial entailment involves a combination of at least two stimulus relations or three stimuli. So if you relate, let's say A and B and C, then some relations should emerge between A and C. So in the case of coordination, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C and C equals E, and this is just like transitivity and stimulus equivalence. But then you will have that combinatorial entailment has combinatorially entailed relations are not necessarily specified depending on the kind of relations that were mutually entailed. For instance, in difference relations, if I learn that A is not the same as B and B is not the same as C, I will not be able to know what the exact relation is between A and C. Or in opposition, or also the combinatorially entailed relation needs not be the same as the mutually entailed relation. For example, in a frame of opposition, if I learn that A is the opposite of B and B is the opposite of C, then the relation between A and C is one of sameness. So if I learn that happy, an English word, is the opposite of sad, and that sad is the opposite of the Spanish word feliz, I can derive that feliz is the same as happy. With comparison frames, you will have the same with difference. Depending on the kind of directly trained and mutually entailed relations, it might be difficult or not possible to specify a combinatorially entailed relation. Okay. And finally, the basic property or core property of relational framing is transformation of functions. Transformation of functions is possibly the property that makes derived relational responding psychologically relevant. And it involves the alteration of the function of the stimuli that are in a relational network in accordance with the entailed relations in that network. So when I have learned that a set of stimuli are related and they have specific relations amongst them, providing or training one of those stimulus to acquire specific psychological function, depending on contextual conditions, might just change the psychological functions of other stimuli. And this is, as I mentioned before, the property that makes derived relational responding psychologically relevant. It is by means of transformation of functions that different parts of the environment's event stimuli acquire their psychological properties without direct experience. So for coordination, relations, this is very straightforward. If I have 3 relations of sameness, A is the same as B, it's the same as C, and one of them I learn that it is dangerous, A is dangerous, then the idea is these functions would transfer to other elements in the network, so C would be dangerous. Obviously, if the relations are of opposition, and I learn that A, for instance, is appetitive, then B would be abrasive. I mean, its relation would change. And with comparison, if I learn that A is more than B and B is more than C, and then I learn that C is dangerous, perhaps I had C is a dog, and I had a bad experience with a dog, it bit me, or I was attacked, and then I learn some relation, like Uncle Mike got a very large dog called Logan, let's go meet Logan. What would happen? The simple fact of thinking of meeting this dog, which I've never seen, I have actually never been in contact directly with this stimulus, the fact of knowing that it's just larger or more than might generate a strong fear reaction. Okay, and I think you can see how this starts being relevant in psychopathology. Okay, the fact that stimuli can acquire functions, psychological functions that might be relevant, like fear or appetitive functions, without direct experience with those stimuli. Now, these core basic properties, mutual and combinatorial entailment, and transformation of functions, refer to different aspects of contextual control. In relational frame theory, we make a distinction between the contextual cues that control the entailment of relations, the type of relations that is established and derived between stimuli. For example, if I learn that Logan is a dog, I'm learning a coordination relation, or that Logan is larger than other dogs, that you're learning a specific relation between dogs and this new element, this new name, Logan. And there's another set of contextual cues that control transformation function. They control the specific behavioral function that will be produced upon those entailed relations. And this is an important distinction. C-funcs or functional cues are cues that specify the relation that is derived. Okay, so I'll give you an example with the same thing with dogs. If I have a child that was bitten by a dog, and then, oh, sorry about that. And then I learn a relation between a new stimulus, the name Logan, and dogs. So Uncle Mike got a very large dog called Logan. Let's go meet Logan. And possibly I might have this transformation, a potentiation of the fear properties of Logan. But then I might also learn that Logan is friendly. Okay, I get this information. This is not about the relations that Logan has with dogs. So the relation is the same. Logan is larger than other dogs, but it actualizes the psychological functions. So perhaps in my history, I have this distinction between a dog that attacked me and friendly dogs. Friendly dogs wag their tails, they go after you, you can pet them. Okay, so the very fact that I'm learning, okay, Logan is friendly, even though it's still in a comparison relation with the general category of dogs, changes the function so that when I think of Logan and meeting Logan, I'm happy with that. Okay. So these core properties of relational framing or arbitrarily applicable relational responding constitute a basic behavioral unit of analysis for the study of language and cognition. So these will be the very basic properties of relational framing. It's important in this point to point out the distinction between arbitrary and non-arbitrary relational responding. Non-arbitrary relational responding is based on the formal or physical properties of stimuli. And this is something that non-humans with adequate training apparently can do very readily. So you can teach animals to, for instance, select the larger of two stimuli. And basically they end up learning that it's the relation between the stimuli and not the stimuli themselves that controls their responding. So even if I consistently reinforce selecting the larger of two stimuli, even when I present a novel pair, a stimulus that you've never seen, but it's the relation is kept constant, a non-human animal might be able to respond based on that relation. Now the thing is, we assume somehow that humans operate similarly, but all of that relational behavior, non-arbitrary relational behavior, is learned under the control of contextual cues, verbal contextual cues. So when I'm teaching my child that something is bigger than some other thing, and they are actually, and that relation is actually controlled by not by the physical properties of the stimuli, I'm just telling them like a basketball ball is just larger than a golf ball. I will be using verbal formulae like is bigger than, is larger than, etc. Eventually, those verbal stimuli will be applied to stimuli that actually are not related on the basis of their formal properties. So this is why, for instance, humans can use these cues to establish a relation between, for instance, physically tiny Leo Messi and considerably larger Cristiano Ronaldo. But some people can learn that symbolically. I don't agree with this, but it's just Messi is bigger than Cristiano. So a relation that was originally learned, relational behavior that was originally learned on the basis of the formal or physical properties of stimuli can be arbitrarily applied based on social convention. Okay. And this, and a very, very important aspect in RFTs, this occurs through a history of multiple exemplar training. So when you are acquiring language, when you are learning to behave verbally with your verbal community, contingencies of reinforcement for establishing relations between stimuli across a multitude of different exemplars, different objects, different stimuli will just conform a generalized relational operand. So once you learn to relate stimuli, you get to the point that you can apply that learning to any sort of behavior. So once you have abstracted what bigger than means, I can tell you that A is bigger than B. You have no idea what A is like. You have no idea what B is like, but you will be able to derive that B is smaller than A. Okay, I think a good way of explaining this is what happens with how to learn, how we learn to name, to use names. So if I'll just give you a few examples. A toddler is learning to orient or point to an object upon hearing its name. So I see a dog, and my dad tells me it's a dog. Okay, the spoken word dog. And then the next time I hear the word dog, hey, my dad, for instance, asks me, hey, where's the dog? And I point to the dog, or I orient towards the dog. There's explicit and there's direct reinforcement for doing that. Oh, you know what a dog is. It's first time you heard the word, the second time, and you correctly oriented towards the dog. Also, it's possible that if I have a verbal productive repertoire, I can imitate words that when I see a dog, I will say its name, and I will also receive, you will be presented with contingencies of reinforcement for that. So think of the first time a toddler just says a name for anything. That's my kid is super intelligent now, he's growing up, whatever. Saw a dog and said dog, okay? And this happens with dogs. This is all explicitly reinforced. So the different relations between names, objects, spoken names, pointing, orienting, all of them are explicitly reinforced. And this happens with dogs, this happens with cats, this happens, of course, with mom and dad, this happens with food, this happens with everything, all sorts of objects and events in the world. And there's a lot of reinforcement contingencies for establishing relations between these stimuli in all possible directions. Now, it gets to a point that this relational behavior is generalized to the point that you only need to be exposed to one of those relations, to one subset of them. So a toddler might just be in the presence of a completely new object, like a robot toy, okay, and learn it's a robot, and then spontaneously the child will just be able to point to the robot upon hearing its name and say the name robot upon seeing the object. And there will be no explicit reinforcement contingencies for this. These will have been established as a generalized operand that can be applied to any sort of stimuli in the world. And actually, this is we did research with this. This is a paper published in 2007. The lead author was Carmen Luciano, about how to establish this repertoire in an infant. She was 16 months and 25 days when she saw the emergence of what we call receptive symmetry, the capacity to point to an object or orient towards an object upon hearing its name. When previously this child had only learned she was presented with the object and heard the name, and then 3 hours later you present. You just ask for the object, and the child is able to select it from a set of other objects. Okay, and this involved training with a large set of objects. I think I'm just in the lower part of the graph. It's like 12 or 13 different objects, and then a test was conducted with 7 novel objects from 14 to 21, and in all cases but one, object 17, the baby was able to, the child was able to spontaneously point the object upon hearing its name. Okay, and then the study is more complex. Basically, at a later age, when the baby was 19 months, visual relations were trained, and as far as I know, it used to be, I don't really know if anymore, it was the earliest evidence of equivalence in a human, the youngest person who showed equivalence relations. So once arbitrarily applicable responding has been established, it develops into increasingly complex relational responding. So far, we have seen the combination of mutual, combinatorial, entailment, and transformation of functions to somehow define what a relational frame is. But those frames combine into increasingly complex relational networks. And then it's also possible to relate relations with other relations, like they were stimuli, basically discriminating the relation between two stimuli, discriminating the relation between another two stimuli, and I will go into that later, and then establishing a relation between them, which would be the RFT basis for analogy and metaphor. And also relational networks can combine with other relational networks, making it increasingly complex. different patterns of arbitrarily applicational relational responding have been demonstrated in the lab with different preparations, not only matching to sample, but with other preparations like the relational evaluation procedure. So we have evidence about coordination relations, distinction and difference, opposition, comparison, temporal relations, hierarchy relations, which are more complex, and deictics, which are a specific type of relational behavior having to do with individual perspective, the distinction between I and you, and the spatial component, the distinction between the here and there, and the temporal distinction between now and then. Okay, and I will go into that a little later. But before we go into more complexity, because the relational frame theory has been updated, and this idea of the increasing complexity of relational networks has even been conceptualized into a model, the HDML model. I think it's relevant that we review the extent to which even basic research on transformation of stimulus functions has an impact and has provided relevant findings for an understanding of psychopathology. Okay? And I will start with the experimental analysis of fear and avoidance. Why fear and avoidance? Because fear and avoidance are involved in most forms of psychopathology, but more particularly in the anxiety disorders. The behavioral approaches to the etiology of anxiety disorders have relied very heavily on fear conditioning. This is the key process explaining how humans acquire fears that are relevant in clinical terms, and also fear conditioning and avoidance learning as the key processes. We have the obvious little Albert idea that poor little Albert, who was, who underwent averse conditioning with John Watson. This is the iconic pop culture example of how fear is acquired by Pavlovian conditioning, including generalization. Okay. Now we know that fear conditioning and avoidance are central in experimental psychopathology, and there's a vast experimental literature on the acquisition of fear eliciting and avoidance evoking functions by stimuli that were previously neutral, basically by pairing them with a significant aversive stimulus or an unconditional aversive stimulus. But the clinical evidence shows that the direct contact with an aversive event is often not necessary for fear and avoidance to occur. So we know that there, in many instances where people have specific phobias or other anxiety disorders, there's a lack of personal history of direct aversive conditioning. There's also this phenomenon that I think was first described by Martin Seligman, the selectivity of fears and phobias, or the fact that not all stimuli seems to be equally potent in producing fear conditioning. And the fact that some phobias are much more frequent than others. For instance, phobias of snakes are much more frequent than phobias of, I don't know, drills or other tools that might actually harm you much more likely in the industrialized world than snakes. We will rarely have a direct conditioning experience with snake. This has also led to ideas that phobias have some degree of biological preparedness. Fear of snakes, spiders, heights, storms would have a phylogenic component. So these would be events that are very readily to be associated with aversive stimulation. So in associative terms, this has been typically accounted for in terms of generalization. Okay, generalization is about the transfer of fear eliciting properties to stimuli that are similar, either physically similar, as in perceptual generalization, or conceptually semantically similar. And here they do not have to be they do not have to be physically alike. So perceptual generalization, this is a relatively recent example. I mean, perceptual generalization has been studied as a process for a very, very long time, but I would say that there's a very, very renewed interest in fear generalization in general. And this is a study by Shmuel Lisek in 2008. I think this one is published in Behavior Research and Therapy, where they obtain a very, very nice generalization gradient to circles of different size. You see the little bolt over circle number 10. This was used as a positive condition stimulus. It was paired with electric shock. And then number 1, the smallest circle, was used as the CS minus. It was presented in a differential condition in preparation. It was never followed by shock. And then you see that the intermediate sizes, all of them, when they are presented, they produce physiological responses, in this case, blink startle, or what we call fear potentiated startle, in accordance with their degree of similarity or dissimilarity with the aversive condition stimulus. Conceptual semantic generalization is a very, very old topic. It dates back to the 1930s and the 1940s. I'm just giving you an example of a very old research by Rees. They use the word earn, and I hope I'm doing my pronunciation correctly, as a condition stimulus. It was paired with electric shock, and then they tested with the words earn, which would be a homophone, sounds very, very similar, and the word vase, which is not physically similar, or it doesn't sound the same, but is semantically related. And they would have stronger fear reactions, stronger conditioned reactions to the word vase. And this is very old research, but again, conceptual and semantic generalization of fear are now the focus of great interest in basic experimental psychopathology research. I'll just give you a much more recent example by Dunsmore and colleagues. They used what we call a sensory preconditioning preparation. I don't know if you're familiar with sensory preconditioning. In sensory preconditioning, you have two neutral stimuli, neutral in the sense that they have not been directly paired with an unconditional stimulus. For instance, the picture of a spider and then the picture of a spider web. Okay, you present them together, and after that, you take the second stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, you pair it with shock, and then you test with the preconditioned stimulus if it produces a fear reaction, even though it's never been paired directly with shock. This is called sensory preconditioning. Now, what these researchers did is they established sensory preconditioning in a differential conditioning preparation that was either matched or unmatched relationally, so or semantically. Basically, if you pair a spider with a spider web and a wasp with a wasp nest, and then this was all counterbalanced, but I've just used the example where you get the shock with the spider-related stimuli. And then you have a mismatched condition where the sensory preconditioned stimuli were mixed, so the spider predicted the wasp net, and the wasp predicted the spider web. And then you have a completely unrelated condition where the spider predicts a waste drum, and the wasp predicts I don't think you see it very clearly, but that's a hospital corridor. Okay, and now they tested all of these three groups, and what they saw is that when there is a semantic relation between the sensory preconditioned stimuli, sensory preconditioning is much stronger. You get stronger fear reactions to the spider if the shock was presented with that semantically related stimulus. Okay. So these are all associative accounts and are supposed to refer to associative processes. And obviously, stimulus equivalence and derived relational responding provide an experimental model of how emotional functions are transferred and transformed, or if you will, how they can generalize symbolically or conceptually. Now, this kind of research, I did my PhD thesis on this topic, typically involves the formation of novel relational networks in the lab with abstract stimuli that are not physically similar, that are not semantically or conceptually related in natural language, and the direct conditioning of emotional fear eliciting functions to some element or elements in the network, and then a test of the transformation of the other elements in the network, the transformation of the functions of the other elements in the network. This research was pioneered by the late Michael J. Doerr of University of New Mexico, who recently passed away, and I just wanted to remember him here because I think his work was an inspiration in this area of research linking derived relational responding and experimental psychopathology. Those three papers, the transfer in accordance with transfer of fear in accordance with equivalence classes, transfer of avoidance in accordance with equivalence classes, and the latest one, which is a transformation of discriminative and eliciting functions in accordance with the relational frame of comparison. But I'll just explain this. I will explain it using my own work. Okay, this is part of my thesis. This was published in 2009, and I just wanted to explain it to you to see how basic research in derived relational responding might help explain some relevant themes in psychopathology. For instance, how human fears are acquired. So this paper provides a demonstration of how fear spreads to safe, physically dissimilar stimuli based on an experimentally derived coordination relation with an aversive condition stimulus. It also demonstrates that this effect is flexible and it changes after a contingency reversal. So it talks also a lot about the C-func properties, not only the relational properties of the network. And in my view, it's important because it gives evidence that is relevant both at the group and the individual level. So basically the study consisted of the formation of two equivalence classes by using matching to sample, two 5-member equivalence classes with a one-to-many training procedure, and then the test of all the ensuing mutually entailed and combinatorially entailed relations. So basically you have two sets of 5 stimuli each, and then some of those stimuli in one of the classes are paired with shock. They are paired with an aversive, an unconditional aversive stimulus. And this is just a picture of an actual physiological record. That's a skin conductance response, possibly one of the simplest psychophysiology measures you can take. The blue line basically is the marker for how long the stimulus was on screen, 8 seconds, and then shock was presented at the very end when the stimulus disappeared, and you see this anticipatory increase in skin conductance that basically is a form of arousal, an increase in arousal when you are presented with that stimulus. Okay, and you see it happens prior to the presentation of shock, so it's not an unconditioned response. So once the two stimulus classes were formed, two elements from class 1, B1 and C1, were systematically paired with shock across blocks of training, and then another 3 blocks followed where the remaining elements in each class, the D and E elements, also underwent the same contingencies. But it's critical here to point out that the first time this aversive conditioning occurs for the D and E stimuli is actually a transfer test, because they've never been paired before with the shock. So the first time you measure the physiological responses in the presence of D1, E1, D2, and E2 is a proper transfer test, in the sense that still the reaction they are producing hasn't been directly trained. After that, there was a reversal in contingencies. Okay, so 2 elements that were presented in extinction, this is a differential conditioning procedure, so these elements had never been paired with shock, now are paired with shock, and 2 elements that had been shocked before from class 1 are now presented in extinction. After this reversal training, you go on with the remaining elements in the class, and you see, and this would be a reverse transfer test. So you get the chance to test if the functions of the remaining elements of the class have changed upon changing the aversive conditioning contingencies for only a subset of those elements. This would be the results for an individual participant, subject 30, which I call my star subject, because he was the one who showed a most orderly pattern of transfer, okay, both in accordance with the original contingencies and after the reversal. So basically what you have here is this would be the D and D1 and E1, and this would be D2 and E2. This first time they show D1 and E1 show a strong condition, not directly condition, a strong fear reaction, okay, that is measured as an increase in arousal, and only by virtue of their equivalence or coordination relation with the directly trained stimuli. And when you change those contingencies, you also get transformation of the functions of for the class 2 elements, and this is interesting because these are elements that actually have a direct history of being presented in extinction. They have never been paired with shock, and they have been presented in extinction for a few trials. But when you change this emotional function of only a subset of elements, they show strong fear reactions compared to the other class. Okay, this would be an individual participant, and this is how we wanted to measure it. We wanted to make sure that participants would show more fear to all of the elements in one class than to the elements in the other class. That would be the real test that transfer was being produced. We get very similar effects at the group level, okay? But actually, if you see, those are the proportions or the percentages of participants in the upper part. Basically, what we had was 14 participants out of 17, more than 80%, showed the pattern of transfer of functions. It's 17 because that's the amount of participants who actually got a differential conditioning effect. You might, this is a fixed number of trials, so you might try to get differential conditioning but not get it in the lab. So that this happens. But still, if you take the complete sample, which was 26, more than half of the participants showed this transfer effect on the test. Okay, but what I'm trying to say is you can get, because this is the kind of group results that you would get in a typical psychophysiology article with with a group design. You get significant effects, but it doesn't really reflect the fact that a large number of participants is actually behaving the way you expect it. Okay. In a more recent paper, we studied the same phenomenon, but also with avoidance behavior. So the design is pretty much the same, and I will not stop into it. The main difference is that in some trials, besides fear conditioning, we also measured avoidance behavior. So in this case, the trial was divided into parts. It was still an 8-second CS duration on the screen, but for the first 5 seconds, we measured the physiological responses, skin conductance, and heart rate. And then for the last 3 seconds, a contextual cue showed up on the screen, and participants could produce a response that would cancel the stimulus on the screen and would prevent the presentation of shock. I think I can explain it better with an example. It was a differential aversive delay conditioning procedure. You had purely aversive or classical conditioning blocks, where you would have the stimulus on the screen for 8 seconds and then the presentation of shock. And also you would have avoidance trials where the stimulus would be on screen for 5 seconds. Then a contextual cue would show up and you would have to produce an avoidance response. In this case, you had to press the arrow keys on the keyboard that matched the arrow on the screen. So if you have an arrow pointing to the right, you would have to press the right arrow key. So if you pressed at least 5 times during 3 seconds, the stimuli were cancelled, no shock. If you fail to do that, you get the shock. Okay, and the design is just the same we used in the prior experiment, but in this case we have obviously a strictly Pavlovian classical conditioning and then an avoidance training phase. And what you have is, and it's important to mention that both responses were measured concurrently. Okay, what you have is avoidance behavior is very clearly controlled by stimuli that are only related to other stimuli under which avoidance has been trained. And an important result in my view is the fact that after the contingency reversal, avoidance, the transfer of avoidance is even stronger than originally. Okay, it makes sense because those let's say CFUNC parts of training made the whole network more coherent, more consistent. On the bottom of the figure, you have the data for skin conductance, which was not as clear as in the prior experiment. So the concurrent measurement of both responses shows us that when you have an available, the possibility to avoid arousal does not keep high. Okay. We also have preliminary evidence of transfer and transformation of function with fear potentiated startle. This isn't yet published. This is part of a funded research project that I had a few years ago, but we haven't submitted it. And the big thing is we used fear potentiated startle because it's supposed to be a better measure, a better physiological measure of fear conditioning. This is electromyogram of the orbicularis oculi muscle in the eye, and then you are presented with a sudden burst of white noise and you produce something like a blink, and this can be recorded. Now the thing with this blink startle is it appears to be very sensitive to the affective balance of stimuli. So if you are presented with unpleasant stimuli, this will potentiate the startle response. If you are presented with pleasant stimuli, this will attenuate the startle response. Also, it's supposed to be very difficult to influence voluntarily, and it's increasingly used in psychophysiological research on fear conditioning. It's supposed to be better than skin conductance. In any case, the design was pretty much the same, but with no reversals. The results we got here are relevant only at the group level, okay, and they're not very strong. This is with the startle reflex. You get a significant ANOVA, a significant class effect for an ANOVA, no interaction, no trial effect, but you wouldn't get a very clear pattern of responding at the individual level. So we didn't have many individual participants that showed this effect. It wasn't a substantial part of the sample, and this is also the same with electrodermal activity or skin conductance. And finally, I will finish my presentation of the experimental analysis of fear with transformation. All of the research I have presented thus far has to do with relations of coordination, equivalence, sameness. There's very little evidence. I think it's this 2007 article by Mike Dewar and his colleagues that fear can be transformed. It can increase or decrease depending on the relational network, or depending on the relations established in the relational network. So this is the last part of my thesis. Much to my embarrassment, it's not published yet, even though it was made a long time ago. But I want to explain it to you very rapidly because I think it illustrates an important part, and it's the influence of both the C-rel and the C-func component in the transfer and transformation of fear. So what we set out to do here was to see if fear reactions will transform, they will increase or decrease according to a relation of comparison. So when you learn that some stimuli are more than some other stimuli, will they produce more fear? And we had to train this with a multiple example training. It was very difficult to do this with a single relational network. We have to train this over several different relational networks so that participants could abstract this whole set of relations. And we had to start with those squares you see on the bottom part as non-arbitrary prompt. So this was very straightforward for participants. They just had to choose which of the two squares was larger. Once that was established, which was almost automatic, we introduced arbitrary stimuli, nonsense syllables, but they were still framed by these squares. So basically you were choosing, let's say, yim over dax. You were selecting yim over dax, but you had this idea that somehow yim was equivalent to the larger of the two. Then this prompt was faded over time so that eventually you only had what we call a transitive inference training, selecting some stimuli other overs without a non-arbitrary prompt. And we trained this with, I'll go back, we trained this with nonsense syllables, with Greek letters, and eventually with abstract pictures, okay? And that would be what we could conceptualize as the C-rel training part. So the part of training that is concerned with the type of relations that you are training in the network, okay? After that, and this, relational network one was the nonsense syllables. After that, the middle term in the sequence, so the middle element was paired with a mild auditory stimulus, 90 decibels, not particular, there were different frequencies, so this wasn't particularly sharp, 1.5 second duration. A smaller element was paired with a softer auditory stimulus, and the larger element in the class was paired with a louder auditory stimulus. And this was done with the syllables, and this is what we would call the C-func training. Basically, you have these relations, okay, this is more than this is more than this, but how does this affect a particular stimulus function? Well, you learn that the largest stimulus predict stronger sounds, okay? And we had two control conditions. One of them removed a C-rel component of training, okay? So basically, you would have participants learning that the D element predicts a mild auditory stimulus, the B element predicts a loud auditory stimulus, and the F element predicts a soft auditory stimulus, but they have no idea about the relation between those elements, okay? And control 2 removes C-func training. So you have the sequence, okay? But, sorry. But you don't have, you only have the mild auditory stimulus for the middle element. And finally, we tested the transformation of fear with a third set. This was the abstract pictures, the abstract drawings. And then here, what we did is we trained with the middle element with a mild electric shock. And well, I don't know to which extent you can say it was mild. It was 500 milliseconds, which is quite a lot, but it's what we would call mild. And then the smaller element was paired with a softer shock. It was shorter, but the current was kept constant. And the larger element was paired with a stronger shock, okay? And these were direct contingencies. I mean, they were actually presented with a shock. But remember, this is delay conditioning. So the first time the stimulus is on the screen, you can measure physiological responding before the shock is presented. So 50% of participants actually showed a pattern of reactions, fear reactions, that was consistent with our criterion, which was showing stronger fear reactions to the B element, the larger element, than to the D element, and in turn, the directly conditioned fear reaction to the D element should be stronger than that for the smaller element. Okay, when you this 50% of participants would cover this criterion, but when you put it, and this is the average for the whole group, the effect for the large element is very clear, not for the small one. It was more difficult to get for the small one. And as for the control conditions, none of them produced this transformation effect, which basically tells you that both the CRL and the CFON components were important in observing this effect. So basically, this effect shows you how fear can change depending on the types of relations that you have learned amongst all of those stimuli. And these are just a few samples of a growing literature on the derived transformation of fear and avoidance. You have lots of references there. The results they provide are consistent with more recent research in the broader field of fear generalization, which is a very important part of experimental psychopathology literature. There's lots of research now on the instructional effects on fear conditioning and generalization. I'm just thinking research by Gaitan Mertens and Jan de Houwer, showing that when you provide specific instructions, information about the stimuli in an aversive conditioning procedure, this might change dramatically the fear reactions that they show. So learning that a stimulus is not dangerous or is dangerous affects how it works or how it produces fear reactions in a fear conditioning paradigm. Okay. Obviously, I've limited myself to talking about fear and avoidance, but this is all early RFT research, but it's all part of a broader body of research on the derived emergence of responses that are somehow clinically relevant or relevant in psychopathology. We have studies that have shown the transfer or transformation of mood. You induct a type of mood, a sad mood or a happy mood for some stimulus in a network, and then you see how other stimuli in the network produce self-reports of the same type of mood, sexual arousal, consequential functions, the fact that a stimulus is aversive or appetitive, even contextual control of self-efficacy expectations, learning that in the presence of a specific contextual cue, you will always fail a task, and this generates a poor sense of self-efficacy, and how this is controlled by other stimuli in the same network. Okay, in my view, this body of research models experimentally how psychological suffering can become ubiquitous or omnipresent, and how our own behavior, including private events, can become part of relational networks of increasing complexity. Okay, and this is key in terms of, I'm just thinking, the very model of psychopathology of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is to a large extent determined by how you relate to your own private events, whether your own your private events somehow function as aversive stimuli, and you engage in very unproductive, unadaptive attempts to avoid parts of your own behavior. The connection with private events is not just theoretical. There's this study in 1992 that shows how the effects of a drug, and by the effects of a drug, I mean the subjective effects of a drug, how the person feels after the drug has been used, can function as a conditional stimulus in conditional discrimination training, and also enter stimulus equivalence classes. So how a very specific private event produced by the use of a drug can become an element in a relational network of coordination with other exteroceptive visual stimuli. And I will just very briefly, this study, it is a human behavioral pharmacology study. Participants were administered with pills. They were physically identical. They didn't know in some occasions. The pills were triazolam, a benzodiazepine, which produced like relaxing sedative-like effects, and some other times it was just placebo. The pill was acting for like 90 minutes, and then participants were trained to choose different visual stimuli on a screen, and they got reinforcement for that. So they learned to choose B1 upon the effects of triazolam, B2 upon the effects of placebo. This is what we call a drug discrimination procedure. This is used with animals. You can train animals to choose different levers or to press a lever under the control of two different contextual cues, depending on the state produced by a drug. Okay. They were also trained to select C1 upon the effects of A1, C2 upon the effects of placebo, and then further equivalence relations were established with the D elements, between C and D elements. And what you have is that in transfer tests, participants were given the drugs, and depending on the effect of the drug, they would choose stimuli that have never been presented to them. For instance, the D elements. Okay. We have more research that somehow involves the discrimination of the participants' behavior and how it acquires somehow stimulus properties. So this is a study by Dermot and Simon Diamond. One of the early demonstrations of multiple stimulus relations in a network. Basically, participants learn a relatively complex or relational network with different relations of sameness and comparison. So A1 was the same as B1 and C1, but it was more than B2 and less than C2, and they were trained to emit a particular operant response to on a keyboard to key press once in the presence of the B1 stimulus. And they also learned that there were other schedules of reinforcement available. So with novel stimuli not involved here in this relational network, they learned to press to emit no key presses or two key presses. And when they were presented with the C1, C2, and B2 stimuli, basically they showed a pattern of operant behavior that was consistent with the relational network. So they responded more to the C2 element, which was large, symbolically larger than, and they responded less to the B element. So the participants' behavior could be discriminated and enter into this relational network. Okay. Okay. Now, in relation to private events, there's specific type of framing, which is deictic framing. Deictic frames specify relations from the perspective of the speaker. So basically, the relationship between the individual and other events serves as the constant condition upon which these relational frames are based. When children respond to questions like, what are you doing now? What am I doing? What are you doing there? The physical environment may be different every time, but the relational properties of the perspective, I versus you, here versus there, and now versus then remain constant. And the development of this deictic relational responding allows the learner to respond appropriately to questions about their own behavior in relation to the behavior of others. It allows the learner to develop a sense of their own perspective and that of other people. And from the RFT point of view, the establishment of deictic framing is key for the development of perspective-taking abilities, such as theory of mind. Okay. So all of the research I have mentioned is has to do with relatively simple relational networks and simple relational frames. The idea in relational frame theory is, even though the research I have mentioned, I think it has important implications for psychopathology, the idea, RFT aims at providing a full behavior analytic account of complex human behavior of language and cognition, and this would include the more complex forms of language and cognition. So increasing levels of complexity need to be addressed, like relational networking, how different frames are combined into a network. And this would constitute a good model of how rule-governed behavior works, how rules produce their effect and control behavior, the relating of relations, analogy and metaphor, and relating relational networks, relating different complex relational networks, which would be an example of how we can abstract a common theme in different complex narratives. Okay, so in relation and networking, we are addressing the combination of different relational frames into increasingly complex relational networks. The idea is that even a simple rule involves the combination of multiple types of relational frames, coordination, temporal, condition, combined in ways that transform the specific behavioral functions of those stimuli and may provide those stimuli with the capacity to control specific responses. For instance, a simple rule like, if it's sunny, then wear a cap to avoid a sunstroke, something that I have to remember myself very often. You have coordination relations, sunny, cap, or sunstroke. They all correspond to objects or events. Okay, there's coordination relations. You have conditional or temporal relation. If condition A is there, then this will happen. So if it's sunny, there will be a sunstroke. If it's sunny, but you wear a cap, there will not be sunstroke. Okay, so the idea is, once you learn to combine these relational frames into more complex relational networks, basically a rule is a relational network where the functions of the stimuli specified in the rule can change and end up controlling behavior. So if I get this rule, if it's sunny, then wear a cap to avoid the sunstroke, I might just go out and see if it's sunny or not, and this will have an effect on my behavior. I will just change my behavior upon the presence of that object. So basically, the rule has transformed the functions of several actual elements in my environment according to the relations specified in the relational network. Now, obviously, an analysis of rules and rule following is, I think it's key to any form of psychopathology. So if you think of different approaches to clinical psychology and psychopathology, like CBT or ACT, they both rely heavily on rules and rule following. So from the point of view of CBT, psychological suffering results from beliefs, thoughts, cognitive schemas, and their emotional and over behavioral effects, and the interventions should be addressed to disputing, modifying, restructuring those rules and fostering more adaptive rules. So it's the idea that I should have more adequate, adaptive, realistic, or rational beliefs. As a different approach in CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, poses that psychological suffering results from excessive reliance on rule following. Basically, I pay too much attention to my, let's say, cognitions, and this prevents contact with the direct environmental contingencies. And interventions are aimed at undermining this excessive form of verbal regulation. So understanding how rules work in terms of relational networks is important. So the key, if I have these instructions or rules, the key for a good presentation is not to be nervous. And I'm here sitting and I'm noticing part of my own behavior that I have identified in my history as being nervous. This will not be very coherent with the way I want to be in a presentation of, if I'm nervous, I will be a failure. You will possibly be motivated to try to avoid that part of your own behavior that you are discriminating as being nervous. Okay. Relating relations and networks. Okay. research has shown that it's possible to establish and derive relations between relations, just like they were stimuli. And this constitutes an RFT model for analogy and metaphor. Both Dermot and Ian Stewart have worked extensively on this, and this is just, I will go very rapidly, an example of one of those experiments where you train different classes, different equivalence classes, and basically what you test is not single stimuli, but compound stimuli that have that are related either as equivalent or non-equivalent, and people, the participants, discriminate the relation between the two stimuli in the complex and are able to select the comparison complex that shows the same relation that that the sample has. Okay, and this constitutes a model of how analogy works. If I tell you that, well, this is a very strange analogy, I'm warning you. Anhedonia is to depression like dysgeusia is to COVID. Okay, let's say I have my 8-year-old child who's learning a lot about COVID at school. They're doing, works. Dysgeusia is, by the way, when you lose the sense of taste. Okay, and she knows this because she has had to learn about a lot of things about COVID, but she doesn't know a lot about depression. I mean, she's 8 years old. So she hears this word, anhedonia. She doesn't know what this is about, and I tell her, okay, you know a lot about COVID. You know what dysgeusia is like. Okay, what if I tell you that anhedonia is to depression like dysgeusia is to COVID? Okay, what happens here? You're establishing relations between these two sets of stimuli. Anhedonia is to would be the relational cue that is signaling that there's a relation between depression and anhedonia, and it's like, so this relation is coordinated, is just the same as the relation that there is between dysgeusia and COVID. So if my child knows that dysgeusia is part of COVID, that it is a symptom, or even that it's a definitory feature of COVID, she might derive that anhedonia is part of depression. It is a symptom of depression. It is a definitory feature of depression, even though she has no idea about what depression or anhedonia are. Even if she knows more, she might even establish more complex networks. Like if she knows dysgeusia is about losing the sense of taste, everything tastes the same, you lose the pleasure of eating, you lose interest in cooking, perhaps, and that would be a lot to ask of an 8-year-old, but anyway, she might derive that anhedonia is like losing a sense of feeling, everything feels the same, you lose pleasure of activities, you lose interest in life. Now, this is relating relations. You can also relate relational networks or more complex relational networks, okay? And I've just put this example here, but this would be very similar to what we had before, but obviously you're not relating very simple relations, but two complex relational networks. So if I tell you that depression is like gradually losing your sense of taste, you don't know why, but everything you eat tastes like a mashed potato and you never feel satisfied. And when everything tastes like that, you keep eating because you must eat to live, but the effort in preparing meals seems pointless and provides no reward. Eating will not satisfy you, you stop caring about cooking, you stop using the ingredients you used to like, and eventually ask yourself, why keep eating at all if you're not enjoying it? You're still hungry and tired of the same plain flavor, and you don't know if you'll ever enjoy food again. So you're getting a lot of information about depression and how depression works based on all of the information in a complex network you get about something you might be much more familiar with, which is having this sensation that you've lost your sense of taste, and how that applies to your life or more generally. Okay. A recent development in RFT, and I think we're just nearly
Near there, yeah.
near there, but okay. A recent conceptual development in RFT, an update of the theory, has been much more explicit in terms of the relevance of the different levels of relational behavior development. So I have just mentioned relational framing would be mutual entailing and relational and combinatorial entailing, but then you have relational networks, relating relation and relating relational networks. And the idea that these forms of arbitrary relational responding interact dynamically along 4 different dimensions, the dimensions of coherence, complexity, derivation, and flexibility. Coherence has to do with the extent to which a relation you derive or learn is consistent with your priorly derived relations. So if I learn that A is more than B, then B is less than A would be coherent. It would be very strange to derive or to be reinforced, to receive reinforcement for deriving that B is more than A. This is not consistent with my prior learning, with my history of learning in relation. Complexity refers to the amount of relations that are entailed in relational framing. For instance, mutual entailment is more complex in a comparison frame than in a coordination frame, because in a coordination frame, combinatorial entailment, because both mutually entailed relations are the same, while in a comparison frame, they are different. So if A is more than B, then the entailed relation is different. B is less than A. Derivation refers to the level of practice of a particular form of derived relational responding. So the first time derived relational responding is emitted, it's very high in derivation. So it is the first time this response occurs, but once it occurs, it obviously it has its own direct history, which might make it much more automatic, which might make it enter into direct reinforcement contingencies. Finally, flexibility, which refers to the extent to which derived relational responding can change upon changes in contextual cues. Okay. Okay, how long do we have?
So yeah, if you want to stop there, or I don't know how much longer.
No, this is just, well, I have quite a few, like I have like another 17 slides, but I think it's a lot. No, I just wanted to mention, this is just an experiment conducted in 2010, and it's just to illustrate how relational frame theory concepts can be applied to explanation of relevant clinical phenomena. So basically, in this experiment, discomfort, the participants had to do a task and they were presented with aversive stimulation in the form of a very aversive noise. So the way you frame discomfort as either in a relation of inclusion with a valued activity or as in a relation of opposition with a valued activity, like a barrier, changed how you perceive discomfort to be, okay? Basically, participants who learn that discomfort was a barrier, something they could not, they had to get rid of before they could engage in a valued activity, evaluated the task and the aversive sounds as much more distressing than participants who learn that discomfort could be part of the task, that you could engage in the task. This is much more complex, but obviously we don't have time. And this form of analysis has led even to very recent conceptualizations of psychopathology in rather complex terms, relational terms, like framing one's private events in coordination with one's behavior. So I behave in coordination with my private events, mostly to avoid them, or framing one's private events as in hierarchy with one's behavior. So my private events are just contained, let's say, or hierarchically less than me, than the perspective of I. And all of this under the control of an overarching motivation or meaningful direction, which would be what we call values in therapy. And this is the next part, but I don't know if we have time for that or...
So we need to take breaks.
If you want, I can talk about that at the end in the
Okay.
panel discussion.
Okay.
So you can bring that in. That's very recent indeed.
That's very
yeah.
recent, yeah. And that's why I left it for the.
Yeah, but
That's fine.
I guess it's been a very thorough explanation of how RFT helps explain etiology. So I think that's really good there. So yeah, is that okay to
Yeah.
break it there? So
yeah,
then you
it's-
can finish them
Okay.
in the panel
Okay.
discussion, right? We're gonna. Oh yeah. Thank you very, very much, Miguel. Thank you for coming all the way from Spain. Thank you for people in Missouri and in America in general attending with around 6 hours difference. So it's the middle of the night there, and some people are watching from Missouri in the middle of the night. So thank you for attending. There's a short break now. It was supposed to be posters on display if we had physical posters, but most posters are online. We don't really need to put them up. So let's just move on then when it's 11:30 to Owen's talk, right? So then I'll see you there, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Should I?
No, so what I'll do now is I'll stop recording first. Stop recording. I hope you got everything in there. So what's gonna happen now is I'll break the call